Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fabio Rossi from Rossi & Rossi Gallery and also Vice President of the Hong Kong Art Gallery Association. First, I wanted to thank all the speakers again for being here today and tomorrow. Many of them came from far away, so I'm very grateful for their presence. I just wanted to thank all the other board members for being very supportive during the process of organizing the symposium. And I want to thank, in particular, of course, Willem, who has been a tremendous help in this, and we have enjoyed working together. And, of course, Jessica and Frida, without whose help and tireless work, this could not happen. It's quite a nightmare of logistics to arrange this event, but they were really patient and very persistent. I think we had a very interesting first session. I think we heard about multiple centers. We heard about Hong Kong being a place for critical thinking, perhaps, and a place where other areas, parts of Asia, can find a place to dialogue and to show work, artists to dialogue. And this, I think, is very important because we want to make sure that Hong Kong is not just a great commercial center, but is also a great center for critical thinking again. And I think that we have some wonderful things happening here. The future opening of M+ will be an amazing event, and it will really change the landscape of the region and of all of Asia. I also think that we live in a very global, interconnected world. I think the diversity of the speaker is a testament to that. Some nationalists might think otherwise, but I think we are connected, and I think Hong Kong can be one of the many, many centers that makes those connections possible. Just a quick introduction about the next session. Which is our Western Museum collecting and understanding contemporary art from Asia. We know there is increased interest, global interest in Asian art in the past few decades, and this has changed the way the West views Asia. The question is a bit rhetorical, and we'll see what the panelists have to say. Do we really need the West to the seal of approval of the West, or do we not? I mean, a lot of galleries often ask the question, what are the museums in Asia in the West doing? How are they looking at Asian art? But perhaps we should think more globally. The lead speaker, the main speaker for this session is Boon, who is the Vice President for Global Arts and Culture Programs and Directors at Asia Society in New York, where he leads the organization Global Arts and Culture Activities. He oversees the Asia Society Museum exhibition program and the museum collection. Prior to this, he was Assistant Chief Executive at the National Heritage Board in Singapore, and as Director of the Singapore Art Museum from 2009 to 2013, he led the transformation of the museum into a contemporary art institution focused on Southeast Asia, and he assembled the largest public collection of contemporary art from the region. He conceived the regional focus and group curating approach of the groundbreaking Singapore Biennial 2013, If the World Change, as well as serving as his project director and co-curator. His latest project including co-curating After Darkness, Contemporary Southeast Asian Art in the Wake of History, and on social political art in Southeast Asia, and the Progressive Revolution, Modern Art for a New India, both of them in New York. And I think, the experience of Boon is perfectly fits this session, and I'm very grateful that he's agreed to be the main speaker. The moderator is Raymond Tang. Dr. Tang is currently curator at of Hong Kong art at the Hong Kong Museum of Art, and he received art training at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and obtained a PhD degree in Chinese art history in the university in 2006. He also gained a graduate diploma in museum studies from the University of Sydney in 2002. His research interests include Ming, Qing, and 20th century Chinese painting and calligraphy, Guangdong collection, and Hong Kong art. The most recent exhibition he participated in organizing is In Search of Zen, the art of Lu Shuoquan, held at the National Museum of China in Beijing. He's also leading his team to conduct research on Hong Kong art, including a survey of Western media art in the pre-1960 Hong Kong, and research on seal collection of the Flagstaff House Museum of Teaware and seal carving in in Lingnan. The other speakers for the session will be introduced by Raymond, but we are very delighted to have Victoria Song from the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, Alan Lau, who is local collectors, but also very active on various boards, including Parasite, and Sarah Raz, an independent curator based in New York. Without further ado, Boon, thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Asia Society Hong Kong. Thank you to the Hong Kong AGA for inviting me and for making this wonderful sort of event happen. It's an honor to be here, and thank you to all the sponsors behind. You have such good taste and intelligence. Do support the arts. That's why you know I'm from New York. We always thank the sponsors. But anyway, it's when I was invited by the Hong Kong AGA, I actually sort of mulled over it for a few days because I felt it was very ironic that you know they are inviting somebody who is Asian and actually physically from Asia, who now is speaking positionally as someone that is leading an institution that is firmly a Western institution and in the US and in New York. But I'll try my best to sort of navigate this kind of both in and out perspective. What I'm going to say is by no means not comprehensive, because that topic about Asian art in the West, modern and contemporary, is very, very vast. There are many, many institutions, not just in the US, but in Europe as well. But I hope to just sketch a kind of almost skeletonal view of some sort of connecting points and a kind of important milestones in history that hopefully could sort of provoke a kind of discussion or further thinking. So please bear in mind, this is not exhaustive, and I think people on the panel will have much more detailed kind of things to begin with. So, it's not a motherhood kind of view, but a certain kind of narrative to make sense of a very complex story and very complex issue with many digressions and U-turns even. So, and I will also say that this sort of story is also a little bit complex because of the role of the institution that I am with, of the Asia Society, in introducing historically Asian art to the US and also modern and contemporary art, but we'll see that. So we begin with this United Press International photograph of visitors streaming into the then Asia House at its public opening in December 1959. So the Asia Society was established in 1956 by John D. Rockefeller III with the express aim of building awareness in the USA of Asia. Indeed, following the end of World War II, in which the US emerged as the de facto leader of the free world order, John D. was prescient in anticipating the rise of Asia, when he said that one could not be ignorant of a region where 2/3 of humanity laid. So that was very important for him, and that's why we sort of began. So Asia Society opened Asia House, a program and office space in New York, which was shared then with the Japan Society, which was another society that he revived after the war. Okay, so this ostensibly is the culture, the society that lost the war, but he still felt it was important to engage with them. So it is from this year, 1959, that the Asia Society Museum formally began. Located at 112 East 64th Street, the Philip Johnson design structure included a library, a garden, gallery, offices, and meeting rooms, and served as the organization's headquarters until Asia Society was able to build a larger structure for its operations at its present location at 725 Park Avenue. What is interesting about this photograph, and of course it's not a photograph from Asia Society, but by the United Press International, is that of course the visitors entering this institution at this momentous era are marked as Asian by virtue of their traditional costumes. Indeed, that was Asia Asia was the land of millennial civilizations. And I'm thus overemphasizing here the timelessness of the cultures of Asia. The result of that in art was that it was traditional art, classical, pre-modern art, art before the 20th century that defined the cultures of Asia in the USA and also in Europe. Hence, Asian collections were already there in the museums of the West, in America, in the US, since its inception in the 19th century. However, by and main, they were mainly, by the time of the mid-20th century, it's basically mostly traditional. The historical and theoretical debates around this are too complex for this session, but suffice to say that the idea that there was, that there was no modernity, no Asian modernity before the coming of the West, whether through empire, through commerce, or scholarly expeditions, was a very deep sort of ingrained sense, and the contrary view was a relatively recent development. Hence, while Asian material was always a part of collecting practices, both private and in the public museums, which were often heirs of the European Enlightenment and also beneficiaries of these private collections, dedicated galleries, and I mean permanent galleries devoted solely to Asian art, most of the time emerged rather late. For example, while the Met in the US has long had Asian art, the Department of Asian Art, that name at the Met, was only designated in 1986. At the same time, the focus was on traditional material in places like the Met, even if they were actually collecting current production. That means they're collecting, sometimes also, for example, basketry and things like that will be made in the then contemporary period. So at the Asia Society, the Rockefellers gave their 200 plus collection of traditional objects, which included sublime pieces of Chola sculptures and Chinese imperial porcelain, which are second to none in the US even today, that formed the foundational collection of the current Asia Society Museum. What was interesting was that, of course, there was no modern art. We're not even talking about contemporary. There was no modern art, though the Rockefellers themselves supported projects in areas such as modern painting from India, especially the work of the pioneering Bombay Progressive Artist Group, which was formed in 1947. Indeed, one of the earliest projects featuring the progressive artists, so we're talking about artists such as M.F. Hussain, S.H. Raza, V.S. Gaitonde, was funded through Asia Society from the Rockefellers in the period 58 to 59, for example. The seminal show Trends in Contemporary Indian Painting traveled the US for over a year, and many of the works sort of ended up also being exhibited in 1962 in the then Asia Society, Asia House. Other than traditional objects, the collection was also rather idiosyncratic in that objects from the cultures that had embraced Islam were mainly also missing. Indian painting, for example, of the Mughal period, did not really find a sort of large place in this. So part of the peculiarity in Asian collecting, or rather collecting of Asian material, especially traditional material, had to do with the formal organizational structure, particularly of the Encyclopedic Art Museum in the West, which over time developed a mix of geographical, chronological, and thematic clusters that do not necessarily gel together. Museums such as the Met and the Louvre, the British Museum, had been collecting the work of living artists for very long. But as mentioned, if you look at these museums, Islam was separated from Asia. So the cultures in Asia that had embraced Islam did not appear in the Asian galleries. They appeared in the Islamic galleries. If you go to the Met now, Mughal India, of course, appears in Islam. The India galleries were solely, mainly Hinduism and Buddhism. The Louvre went even further. They retained Islam, so the Louvre retained the Islamic gallery, while ceding Asia to the New Guinea. But non-state forming cultures of Asia were the prerogative of the Quai Branly. Okay, so Indonesia, classical material was there, Hindu, Buddhist, but if you were a sort of what we call non-state forming culture, if you were Batak or Nias, you were in the Cape Bronley. You know? So I think there are certain kinds of historical structural factors that has to do with the way the Western museum, particularly the Encyclopedic Art Museum, developed. And when modern and contemporary art came, it sort of added a different kind of spin to it, because it frequently, when it came to this kind of museum, it emerged in a different department. Okay, so where does the modern and the contemporary sit in the narrative of Asia in the Encyclopedic Art Museum? You know, who buys? Who is responsible in this kind of museum to buy that art? You know, is it the modern and contemporary section, or is it the Asian section? What if they disagreed, you know? Does one fold contemporary, modern, and Asian art into a vaguely global art narrative? Or does one emphasize the different roots and parallel trajectories of art from the Asian region as other regions as well? Where do we place, for example, diasporic artists? Do we position these artists in relation to their cultural homeland or their new national context? I'll return to this point a little bit later in relation to the positioning again of the modern and contemporary Indian Encyclopedic Art Museum. So in considering the place of modern and contemporary Asian art in the Western Museum, one has to acknowledge the role of a rising awareness of a global art scene or art sector. In this regard, we find that the history is very unfair. What I mean is that certain very specific events, very specific platforms, and sometimes even specific individuals have overwhelming sort of impact on the presence of Asian contemporary art in the West. I'm just going to highlight very briefly, three sort of areas or incidences or platforms. And these predominantly occurred from the end of the 80s to the 90s and the very early 2000s. So those were the period when you got a kind of big push in terms of a general awareness, whereas before you had very specific instances, but a kind of general dissemination of a general awareness of modern and contemporary art from the region that we call Asia today. Number one was, of course, in 1989, Jean-Hubert Martin's The Magicians of the Earth at the Centre Pompidou was extraordinarily important. And why it's important? Actually, relatively very few people saw the show. Only about 300,000 people saw the show, and the catalogue initially was not translated even into English. What it did was to shake the dominance of the Euro-American art as global art. Half of the 104 exhibited artists were from non-Western lands. And the way each artist was presented was to convey the idea that all art from all lands was equal. You know, it flattened the distinction. So each work was accompanied by a map that showed where each artist was from, and each artist had the map pivoted in a way that his or her location was at the center of the world, more or less. So I think there was a great kind of effort to flatten the distinctions between the West and the non-West. Everyone, I think, who aims to talk about global art needs to study the documentation and the responses of this exhibition. It's extraordinarily important. Again, what's extraordinary is that actually not that many people saw the show, given the number of visitors to Paris. This exhibition is now a flashpoint and marker for the global turn in art, opening up conceptual and eventually physical space for Asia in the West. So the slide shows a Richard Long wall work alongside a painting by artists, not one, but artists from the Yuendumu community in the Northern Territory of Australia. Again, there was a kind of deliberate reason to juxtapose, to almost let them be in the same space with no apology, and interestingly enough, which we'll get to, one of the criticisms is that context is sorely missing. One of the causes of flattening, of presenting every work as equal to each other, unfortunately, is that, the context was missing. Next one. And then closer to home, of course, in the year very soon after that, in 1999, for the 48th Venice Biennial, Cai Guoqiang came and showed Rent Collection Courtyard. And of course, he was also to win the prize. And it was one of those incidences that really, through the Venice Biennial, brought the idea that there was contemporary art from China, that the so-called experimental art was worthy of global consumption on the world stage. But what was even more important was actually the research expeditions that the curator was brought to in China that led to finally this sort of exhibition, because I think what was important was that those sort of research expeditions helped to catalyze interest in the scene outside China itself. Then, of course, and I'm not blowing my trumpet because this has nothing to do with me, Asia Society in the US was very, very important and seminal in establishing modern and contemporary Asian art in the US. And, you know, they started looking, my predecessors started looking at modern and contemporary art for one reason, because a very famous sort of scholar and curator and art historian in the US spoke to, I think, one of our past sort of presidents, and basically there is no such thing as modern art or contemporary art in Asia. There's no such thing. You know, we just have Chola bronzes and, you know, everything else is not worth looking at. So that was very sort of provocative for the then sort of leaders at the Asia Society, and led to the reason why they sort of started this program of looking at modern and contemporary art from this region. And in particular, you know, sorry, I got my slides mixed up. In 1996, Traditions, Tensions, Contemporary Art in Asia brought the contemporary art of India, of Indonesia, of Philippines, of South Korea, of Thailand, a very idiosyncratic mix to the fore, emphasizing, in a sense, you know, the relationship with artisanal traditions, the relationship with local histories and local concerns. And what it did was it brought a recognition that despite the West, important centers of art production and active art scenes were developing in Bangkok, in Bombay, in Manila, in Yogyakarta. And artists such as Kim Suja, Nalini Malani, Nawin Ramanchiku, and Harry Dono from these early sort of exhibitions were still in the early stages of their career. And 98, of course, Inside Out New Chinese Art, curated by Gao Minglu, was the first major museum presentation of contemporary Chinese art, and marked the launch, basically, of the careers of many Chinese artists in the US, including Zhang Huan, who is pictured here performing Pilgrimage, Wind and Water at the PS1 Contemporary Art Center, who then, they had not joined with MoMA yet, who was one of the partners of this exhibition that was organized by the Asia Society and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And this first major US survey of post-cultural revolution Chinese avant-garde art electrified art audiences in the country and around the world, and sparked basically a lot of dialogue about this new scene. So leading to 2007, when the Asia Society presented the first US museum retrospective of Zhang Huan. They also did the Thai artist Montian Buma, for example. And then with South India, Edge of Desire with India, Edge of Desire, Recent Art in India in 2005 was the first museum survey of Indian contemporary art since the early 90s, and was notable for including not just urban modern artists, those artists that we hope will be global, but also Adivasi, or artists from tribal communities, as part of. So, you know, it seemed to be also taking a kind of leaf from Magicians of the Earth, you know, to look at the full expression of that. Alongside this growing awareness of the idea that Asia is outside the US, there was also early steps in recognizing that there was the Asian contemporary that was internal to the US. So the curious phenomena of diasporic and immigrant artists. So at a time when very few museums in the US included Asian artists in their exhibitions and collection, the Asia Society in 1994 did the show Asia America, Identities in Asian American Art, which captured a moment in the country's history where debates around identity politics and multiculturalism was active. How interesting that it is relevant again. And this is 94. By 2006, when the exhibition One Way or Another, Asian American Art Now happened, the position of these artists that we call Asian American in relation to the US were very different. Most of the artists in this 2006 exhibition were born in the US during the 1970s, and their concerns were thus less on an immigrant experience, but more on being members of a then multicultural nation. So it's worth noting that despite all these, the first curator, full-time curator paid in a museum of Asian and Asian American contemporary art in the US was also only started in 2001. At the Asia Society, and that, of course, was Melissa Chu. So that gives you a sense also of how recent this is, but also of the speed of the development. So I'm going to jump ahead because I have very little time. The legacy of how modern and contemporary art and by whom, how it is presented in the Euro-American Museum seems also to have implications on the form and the style of art that is frequently emphasized. What I'm suggesting as the beginnings of a kind of conceptual exploration that is very preliminary is to try and understand the factors and the sort of forces that impinge upon the resulting presentation and collection of modern and contemporary Asian art in the Western sort of museum. Your approach can be, and I'm really simplifying this for heuristic purposes, you can be additive, you are adding on to what is already there in the Western Museum, and hence, you could be emphasizing the difference. You could be incorporative, you try and absorb yourself into the Western, the Euro-American narrative, and so it will be similarity. So the second part, similarity, for example, that seems to happen when curators and art historians and sometimes galleries sort of, and even artists emphasize that their art is not Asian, it is global. When they emphasize, for example, abstract art that does not have markers of ethnic or cultural identity. So of course, there are many exceptions, but what I'm trying to emphasize is kind of pull in sort of two directions. And the reality frequently, of course, is a hybrid of the two. So examples, this is the New Korea Gallery at the Brooklyn Museum, in which you emphasize a kind of difference that modern and contemporary Asian art is incorporated in the Asian galleries. So you see the Dansekwa works there, and you see Nam June Paik, in the same sort of space. And then our own sort of version at the Asia Society, Wang Gongxin's two lions, their video works next to this Chola Krishna defeating the snake demon. So difference and similarity changes who one sits at the exhibition or curatorial table with. Do you sit with Asia, or do you sit with this abstract sort of global art that essentially frequently is a kind of proxy for Euro-America? Differences in aesthetic tastes, sort of determine that. How much leeway do we give, therefore, in the incorporation of Asian art to the historical context of art production, and how much we give to the internal aesthetic and conceptual development? So these are heuristic categories, or which yearn for specific examples to be mapped against, and likely, the examples that we give will exist in a spectrum between these two sort of poles. The reality is more mixed, but I think it will be more illuminating, for us to understand different styles of curatorial and exhibition presentation in the West. I just want to end with two issues that the Western Art Museum, particularly the encyclopedic, but also the Modern and Contemporary Museum faces. One, that in non-Western cultures, in Western cultures, we have to resolve two issues in the absorption of modern and contemporary art from Asia. One is the art and artisan divide, which in Euro-America, has to do with the way art sort of came about. And I'm reminded of, for example, Gautier once said that, art has absolutely no function. That's the purpose of art. It is as useful as a toilet. That's what it is. You just use it for that and sort of nothing more. So especially with the millennial civilizations of Asia, indigenous artistic traditions, and they need not be craft. Okay, let's be very clear. It can be craft, but it need not be craft. For example, ink painting is a conceptual problem. It's a conceptual problem for the Euro-American narrative, and as a result, how to sort of incorporate that. Do you appear in the Asian gallery, or do you appear in the modern and contemporary gallery? The preference, for example, in some sectors for abstract ink rather than representational ink, and the tendency to describe, you can read it with reference to Western abstraction and horror of horrors. I've read certain ones that kept mentioning Jackson Pollock for some bizarre reason. But it occurs, I'm sure, you can see it in many sort of public, we can laugh at it, but I think it comes from a particular kind of mindset. So, Anne Samad, an artist from Malaysia that works with indigenous weaving, and she's a weaver, who builds using literally a loom, these kinds of objects where she weaves, household items into these kinds of installations that are almost, I hate to use the word, but, sometimes almost totemic, but it seems almost Orientalist to describe them as totemic. So there are things like that are not straight craft. I mean, she's not weaving like a Japanese basket or not. So it is a kind of thing that is sort of out there. Of course, ink painting, Sun Xin, this work in our collection, and with Sun Xin, who works with wood block print and not abstract but representational ink, how do you describe that? If you have one work, it's fine. You have one artist, it's fine. How do you have a collection in that? And I'm very interested in how the M+ is going to deal with that in its permanent galleries. And then, of course, the big elephant in the room, which is sort of like my lifelong project, is this issue of the derivativeness problem. The elaboration of Asian modernity at the local level is now critical. I would say that we cannot really deal with the positioning of contemporary Asian art in the Western institution until Asian scholars or people who are committed to art history of Asia deal with modernity. And the case studies, and what is needed now is less theoretical work, I feel, but case studies of specific instances of modernity throughout the regions of Asia to demonstrate. Everybody talks about it. Very few people really elaborate on it, to demonstrate parallel, multiple, whatever you call it, that there are many modernities, that modernity belongs to all the art scenes of the world. It is not a European kind of invention. I feel that is critical now in order for this issue of the contemporary to be resolved. So I just want to end, for example, when we did a different perspective after darkness, which is how artists who have lived through massive political change in their country, what do they do with their art? So the show After Darkness, Southeast Asian Art in the Wake of History, So you Hasono, Dinkule, all behind. But what is interesting was I was really happy that Jason Farrago, from who, had this kind of quote, that yet what works in New York may not work in Jakarta. And while we now have to evaluate art on a global scale, we also have to study the particular circumstances in which global contemporary art, I hate this word global art, takes root in local cases. In these three countries, an outward-facing practice of contemporary art marched in step with local reform movements, engaged with free speech, economic fairness, and multi-party democracy. If some artists in this show seem to be speaking a little too literally, and you hear that always from Western curators, that may be because influencing local audiences was a more urgent calling than winning the approbation of far-off Western institutions. So he's talking about the work in this show. I think it's worth reading this review, not because I curated the show, but just the perspective of a journalist, an art critic from one of the citadels of global contemporary art. Okay, and part of the problem is things like that. We are doing a show on the progressive artist group, the first group after independence in India. It's things like that. We have problems with things like that, and the influence of Cubism, for instance, on that. I'll just leave it at that. And this is the group. And if you have time, if you're in New York before January the 20th, I highly encourage you to come and see our show, The Progressive Revolution, because what we are trying to say in this show is that artists being artists, one, that all art is derivative. Okay, what is the impressionist but derivative? When they were looking at African masks, of course it's derivative, but that doesn't mean it's not original at the same time, So the show has one very simple premise, that the Bombay Progressive, this modern movement, the artists were taking ideas from within India, from their own classical culture, their folk culture. They were absorbing ideas from other parts of Asia, from Japanese, from Chinese landscape painting. Mohan Saman, the artist that became not Indian, but American, because he's in the collection of the MoMA, and the Indians forgot about him. He was very angry that the Indians forgot about him because in his own words, he paid the membership fees for his Indian society. He said, why do they think that I'm an American artist? But we're showing, this is a detail of a work called Midnight Fishing Party from 1977, and these are paper cutouts that he cut and folded. So it's actually one sheet of paper. But of course, what is the inspiration for this? Is the Javanese shadow puppet. So he was a big collector of these, So they were also looking at other parts of Asia. Just because you're Asian doesn't mean you are ignorant or you only look at the West. They were looking. In fact, I think currently we are more insular than the artists in this period, So similarly, Hussein's horses, obviously the impact of going to China in 51 and looking at the Tang horses, and also the work of Xi Beihong was very, very seminal. So it was not just the West, artists were learning in the modern period from many things, including within Asia as well. That's the very simple point that we're making. But what I'm suggesting that now the work, in a sense, as I told one of the organizers, why should you care what the West thinks? I think we are at a kind of moment where we know now that the narratives are very complex, that we don't necessarily follow, that there's a limit to which Asian modern and contemporary art can be incorporated into the Euro-American narrative. Sometimes they are not art historical issues, sometimes they are purely organizational issues. So really now it's for the other countries outside the Euro-American sphere, and it's very ironic because I represent a US institution. In a sense, to seize that chance to really grapple with this idea of how similar and how different we are. So, okay, if you're not shocked enough, thank you.